That's 4 o'clock set, so started recording.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Education and Skills Policy Development Committee meeting of the 21st of July. 21st of July, my God, I've gone back in a time machine. I'm looking at the minutes. Now, the 15th of September on a lovely sunny evening. So we'll crack on without further ado. Can we have any apologies for absence, please?
I haven't received any yet, Chair.
Anyone else? No? Okay, thank you. Disclosure of personal and prejudicial interests, are there any? No, thank you. And now we move on to the minutes of the last meeting, which was actually held on the 21st of July. Can we go through the minutes page by page, please? Page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. If we are content, can we approve and sign the minutes, please? We content? Move and second.
I wasn't there, Mike, sorry. Sorry.
We okay? Move, Mike Lewis, Bev, Lyndon, Sam, Anna. Yeah, we're all okay. Yeah, lovely, thank you. So we're moving on now to point number 4, which has been a very keen topic of debate for us all, I know, formally in meetings and outside the meetings. Can I move on to data trends on vulnerable learners, please? A presentation from education colleagues.
Thank you, Chair. I'll introduce Mike Jones, who's joined us as our Data Officer in Education in a minute, but just to reflect really on the ask from the last meeting. So I think it was Councillor Lawson who was particularly interested in what makes a school be in a challenging context. And we looked in earnest really at our headline data in terms of certain vulnerabilities. So obviously free school meals has always been an indicator, not to say it's the best indicator, it's often the tip of the iceberg in terms of vulnerabilities of children. We also looked at our exclusion data as a second topic. Mike will also be taking you through some interesting information about the vulnerability assessment profile we have in Swansea. And finally, during the presentation, I'll be touching upon Operation Encompass, what that actually means in terms of the vulnerability of children and their well-being. So without further delay, I'll bring Mike in really to present, and we'll take some questions as we go along, if Mike is comfortable with that, per those sections, those 4 sections, if that's okay. Thank you, Mike.
That's fine, thanks, Helen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just share my screen so we can see the PowerPoint, which might be a technical challenge, but will that work okay?
Yeah, that's just come through, Mike.
Brilliant. Yes, we hope the technology works. We did have a BT man up the pole opposite my house earlier, fiddling with the wires, so I'm hoping he hasn't disconnected anything. Okay, I'll move through the slides. We've looked at, as Helen said, a number of different aspects. And the first one here is the free school meals. So the table and the charts which follow show over the last 10 years or so the numbers and the percentages of pupils in years 1 to 11 who've been eligible for free school meals. And we can see that it declined from 2012 down to around 2016. It then stayed stable just over 19% for a few years. But in the last 3 years, it has climbed a bit. And in the 2021 data, this is the only data collection that will have actually been affected by the pandemic directly, because this was collected in April this year. The 2020 data was in January 2020, so it was just before the pandemic really sort of hit and the lockdowns came in. The increase in free school meals in the last few years started to be caused by the introduction of universal credit, which changed the eligibility criteria for free school meals. So what we saw was a slight increase, a couple of percent or thereabouts, largely because of the universal credit coming in. Alongside this, though, the government introduced Transitional Protection for free school meals. And effectively what this means is that any people who's been eligible for free school meals at any time since the 1st of April 2019, even if it's only for a day, will have protected free school meals until at least the end of the 2023 calendar year. And that's even where the true eligibility has ceased, so they can still get a free meal. When we looked at the figures in August for our monthly report, if we look at the total number of pupils we had, I think it was on the 25th of August, who were either eligible for free school meals or they were transitionally protected, the number had actually gone just over the 10,000 mark. I think it was about 10,030 or thereabouts. So there are quite a lot of transitionally protected pupils no longer eligible. Another issue that we've seen in this data, if pupils cease eligibility for free school meals, they then have this transitional protection. And what seems to be happening, and there's some data I think available by the benefits team for this, if they then become eligible again because the parents perhaps go on to eligible benefits, they don't bother reapplying for free school meals because their children are getting the free meal via the protected system anyway. So we think that the 6771 there that we can see for 2021 is probably an undercount of true eligibility at that point because of the people who haven't bothered to reapply. Let's scroll down to the chart there. So there's the chart of the actual numbers. These are the pupils in the statutory age groups, years 1 to 11. We can see there that rise in recent years. So the introduction of the universal credit, and then of course the effect of the pandemic in the most recent years data there. And we can look at it in percentage terms as well. So we can see it increasing there to 23.6% in April 2021, which is the highest free school meals percentage we've had, as we can see there, in many, many years. So there's the pandemic effect there and perhaps the universal credit effect in that as well. Before I move on, are there any questions on the free school meals data?
Sorry, Mike. It's Mike Dirk. It is. Mike, thank you very much.
Right.
Can I just ask about, do we continue, does the transitional free school meals, does that still apply now?
Yes, it does. Yes. At the moment, it applies, so any pupil who's been eligible for free meals from 1st of April 19 will get protected meals even if eligibility ceases up until the end of December 2023. And then beyond that, to the end of the school phase that they're currently in at that time. So if they've only just joined perhaps year 1 in a primary, they'll then get that right through until the end of year 6, so another 5 or 6 years. And similarly, if they've just joined year 7, perhaps in a secondary school at that point, they'll get it until the end of year 11.
Thank you, Mike. I find that a bit puzzling. I wasn't aware of that, to be honest. I find that quite interesting. So if somebody is, let's say, unemployed, but then they get quite a well-paid job, their children are going to remain on free school meals for some time afterwards.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's to do with the rollout of universal credit, and of course, there's been various things in the news about that. But I think the universal credit, they introduced this transitional protection as perhaps a bit of a sweetener there. I think that was the idea. The transitional protection is in England and Wales. I'm not sure about Scotland and Ireland. I presume they've got something similar there.
Good. I'm glad to hear there's additional protection there with the advent of universal credit. I just wasn't aware. Thank you. Lyndon Jones has got his hand up. Lyndon?
Yeah, fine, thanks. So, rather similar to you, Mike, I'm obviously pleased that they got that transitional amount in, but obviously that 23.6 in reality, if you were to take that transitional amount out, would be lower, much lower perhaps.
This figure excludes the transitional. This is only the eligible.
Right. Okay.
So the percentage actually getting a meal will actually be higher than that.
Right. Okay. Thanks for the clarification. But obviously, we don't want anybody to be losing out.
Thank you, Lyndon. Can you carry on, Mike? No other hands are up.
Certainly. So, coming on to another measure of deprivation, we have the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a Welsh Government statistical exercise, effectively. And what they do here is they look at all of the areas of Wales and they measure deprivation using, I think, 8 different domains or different types of deprivation. So things like access to services, health, income, employment, education, community safety and so on are built into this model. In 2019, they updated the model. So what we've done here is we've looked at our school census, which was in April this year, and we've mapped the pupils back onto the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. And we've divided it into bands, 10% band deciles. So decile 1 on the left-hand side refers to pupils who live in areas which are classed as being in the 10% most deprived in Wales. And then on the right-hand side, decile 10, the 10% least deprived areas in Wales. And we can see that we've got peaks there, largely on deciles 1 and 2, which is the 20% most deprived areas, but also again on 9 and 10, the 20% least deprived areas. So it does seem to illustrate that we've got a bit of polarity there in the school population, with the peaks being at the 2 opposite ends. We have a smaller peak there on decile 4 as well, but we can see relatively little in the middle there. So Wales is divided into around 2,000 areas for this exercise, which are called lower super output areas. They're areas defined by the Office for National Statistics. On average, they contain around 1,500 residents, and there's about 150 of those areas in Swansea. They're all subdivisions of the wards. Morriston, being the biggest ward, has got the most subdivisions in it. But 11 subdivisions, I think that one's got. And Sketty's got about 8 or 9, I think, as well. That's how the index works. And each year we do this exercise, mapping the pupils onto these areas. And this particular chart that we're looking at here is all the pupils, but we do this per school. So every school gets an analyzer where they can analyze this, and we can plug in any particular school into that quite easily, or we can put a group of schools and show a group of schools on the chart and see how what that is telling us. And as you can imagine, when we look at contrasting schools, we get very, very different charts here, with some schools with a lot of polarity right down to deciles 1 and 2. One school almost 100% on decile 1, another school's quite close to it. But equally, we've got some other schools which are close on 100% down on the deciles 9 and up on the decils 9 and 10 as well. So it does paint quite an interesting picture. There is a correlation between the WIMD and the free school meals percentages, but it's not as good a correlation as you might expect. The reason for that is that free school meals is really only measuring income-based deprivation, because you have to be on eligible benefits to claim free school meals, whereas the WIMD is looking at a much wider range of deprivation. So one example we use when we're training school governors on this is if you look at somewhere like Rossilly, you wouldn't think Rossilly was deprived. But if you look at the access to services domain, it's highly deprived because it's a long way from facilities such as hospitals and shopping centres and things like that. So this WIMD model brings into account factors beyond those which are just linked to the income deprivation, if you like.
Can I ask a question there, Mike? Thank you very much.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. It really helps to flesh out some of the issues that we've had raised with us previously about place-based issues. So when we look at the divisions in Swansea, we've got about 150 areas in Swansea with the subdivisions. Do we know how many of those belong to the most deprived 10% at the moment? I think in a former version of the WIMD, it used to be about 12 most deprived subdivisions. So as you say, Morriston might have 11 areas, but maybe 1 or 2 have the most pressing evidence of multiple deprivation.
Yeah, that data is available from the Welsh Government. There's a table of all of the super output areas, all 2,000 in Wales, and they're ranked where number 1 is the highest deprivation. So you can sort them in the table quite easily on that and filter down to the Swansea ones, and it'll give you that information. So yes, that is readily available.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Are there any more questions on the?
Yes, we've got Lyndon Jones has his hand up as well.
Sorry about that. Yeah, one of the things I think, Chair, we've talked about it before in areas like Bishopston, which my ward, where you wouldn't expect but be deprivation, but you get a situation where many people have got such high mortgages, they've got more limited cash available, and that does cause a problem, because you get people who are probably asset rich in that sense but cash poor, and they can come into this sort of area.
It'd be interesting. I don't know if that's being picked up in the WIMD. It'd be an interesting one to ask Welsh Government. I'm familiar with the education domain of this. I was on the working group with it originally, but I haven't been involved with the other domains. So it'd be interesting to see what they've got in there. I suspect they're only really looking at income deprivation.
Yeah, but if you look, actually dig down into that income and available income, you find very often people are paying absolutely massive mortgages. You're talking about a 2 double bedrooms and 1 single bedroom bungalow, 439,000 now in Bishopston.
Yeah.
And people going in to buy that will have an absolutely massive mortgage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I do know, just to add to that, Lyndon, I do know that the WIMD under the income domain, they focus on income-related benefits claimant count only. So they don't look at actual income levels, it's income-related benefits claimant count is the one thing. So perhaps they don't capture that important information alluded to there. Can I ask Councillor Des Thomas, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's fascinating, I know, listening to the stats and all these things that are collected over the years, and we've had the benefit of Mike's presentations in the past, and we're always amazed by the amount of data that is collected. But on Lyndon's point there, where people are asset rich but cash poor, of course, people may be living further away from facilities, but they have the ability to access those facilities, don't they? Invariably, the residences on the west, or the people living on the west, have probably got more access to vehicles. There are 2, 3, 4 vehicles per household, and therefore accessibility to the facilities such as hospitals and supermarkets, is reduced from that sort of angle, isn't it? And I assume that all that is taken into account as well, Mike.
I don't know the answer to that one, because they'd be looking at transport links and things there, I suppose. I know in the access to services domain, they're looking at availability and I think the proximity of key services like hospitals and shopping and so on. I don't know how much detail they have in that data. I'm just wondering if it's published. That may be published on the WIMD website, but I'll have a look for that.
Okay, thanks.
I'm getting quite excited with my mouse finger here. It's pushing everything apart from the mix button. Then, thanks, Des. I've got some information here. When we're looking at access to services, I know we've got to focus on education and skills, of course, but access to services, they count physical access to services, average return travel times by public and private transport, pharmacy, food shop, GP, surgery, post office, etc., schools, etc. And they also count the key performance indicator. The second key performance indicator is broadband access. So digital access is a key indicator now as well. I think that's a new one to me. And when we bring it back to education, we're looking at foundation phase average points, those key stage 2 average points, key stage 4 average points, repeat absenteeism, proportion of key stage 4 leavers, entering higher education, and by that they mean for what we used to call further and higher education, so post-16 education, and the number of adults is 25 to 64 with no qualifications. So for me, it's interesting to look at the underlying information and to see whether we can join the dots up, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And also moving forward with that, a number of the indicators which are part of the education domain will not exist in the future with the new curriculum. So we won't have the key stage results, for example. We'll still have point scores from key stage 4 in some shape or form, but we won't have those earlier key stage results in there. It's not very clear at the moment what they can be replaced with that can be universally collected and analysed right across the whole country in this form.
Right, thank you.
We okay to move on?
Yeah, there's nobody indicating at the moment. Thank you, Mike.
Next one, a little bit of text on this. We have the vulnerability assessment profile, which we've been running now for, I think, about 10 years across all the schools in Swansea. And the VAP was last run in 2019. The pandemic, unfortunately, got in the way of doing this for 2020 and 2021, because, of course, it affected a lot of the data which would be included on the VAP. So we are planning to run one in November. As long as we get fairly normal data through the rest of this term now, we're hoping to be able to run one in November to update it. So this analysis is based on the most recent VAP data, which was done in April 2019. So the pupils are assessed on, there are 14 different categories. So it includes literacy, numeracy, additional learning needs, attendance, free school meals, exclusions, looked after children, and a number of other factors on there. And each pupil can get a score between 0 and 30 on the 2019 version of the VAP. The vast majority of pupils, in fact more than half of them, score 0 or virtually 0, because everything from the data point of view appears to be fine for them. They're attending school fine, they don't have additional learning needs, they're not coming from perhaps high deprivation backgrounds, they're not moving schools frequently, and so on. But we do get usually about 8 to 10% of each year group where they do get relatively high scores. So what we've done here, we've looked at the average scores for all of the pupils who were in years 1 through to 11, the statutory age pupils in April 2019. And I pulled out a few key points from the data. And the first one is that the average score for boys is 4.3 compared to 3.6 for girls. Some of that can be explained from the exclusions data, because boys have far more exclusions than girls. And it can also be explained by the additional learning needs data, because a lot more boys have additional learning needs than girls in the data. So those two things added together will probably just about explain that difference by themselves. When we look at pupils of different ages, there are not significant differences between the pupils across the year groups. The average scores are very, very similar, but we do see slightly higher scores with the oldest pupils, years 9, 10 and 11 in the secondary schools. And I think that's to do with exclusions, because those 3 year groups are the peak years for exclusions. 9, 10 and 11 get more exclusions than any of the younger year groups. So there are 2 factors in the VAP for exclusion: the number of exclusions they've had and how many school days they've lost as a result of the exclusions. So I think that's the main factor that's causing that there. Pupils with additional learning needs have much higher VAP scores than those who haven't got additional learning needs. We have to be careful though, because additional learning needs is part of the VAP formula itself. So the fact they've got additional learning needs will push the score up by itself. But they do tend, as we'll see in a later slide, to be pupils from more deprived backgrounds, higher free school meals and so on, which will add additional scores on for the VAP for them. Quite a telling one, if we look at free school meals pupils, those eligible for free school meals, they have average VAP scores of 8.0 compared to 2.9 for the non-free school meals pupils. Given the number of pupils involved here, roughly 2,500 to a year group, across all those year groups, 11 year groups, that's quite a significant difference. We've also correlated the VAP, the average scores, with the Welsh index of multiple deprivation that we've just seen. We can do this for each of those deciles that we saw. Decile 1, the 10% most deprived, have an average score of 6.9, and that compares to just 1.6 for those who are living in areas classed as being in the 10% least deprived. Looked after children have scores nearly 3 times those of their peers. We have to be a bit careful with that one because the number of looked after children is quite small compared to the size of the school population. We're talking there perhaps about 300 or 400 in these year groups compared to, I think it's something like 28,000 overall in that population. And then the final two are looking at the former national reading and national numeracy tests. These worked on what was called a standardised age score, where pupils are given a score between 69 and 141, where 100 is the normal for your age, so it's an age standardised score. So the actual score they get in the test is adjusted to take account of how old they were at the time they take the test. What we found with the reading is that pupils who scored below 93 on the age standardised score are the pupils who tend to have the higher VAP scores, so indicating that the poorer readers are showing more vulnerability across the rest of the VAP. With numeracy, it's not quite so pointed. A score of 97 or below gives us the higher VAP scores, which is perhaps a little bit more like we'd expect with that one. The other problem is that there are 2 numeracy tests, but only 1 reading test. Apart from those in Welsh medium who do 2 reading tests, the majority only do the 1 test. So it does get a bit skewed towards the numeracy test because of the greater amount of data which is in there. But these are some of the key figures that we can get from the 2019 VAP. We could, of course, draw out a lot more than this given the amount of data that we've got. And one of the things I'll be interested in is when we run the next VAP to see if we're still getting the same pattern out of it. The next VAP is going to be considerably enhanced compared to the 2019. We've got a lot of new data items being added on, and the maximum score is going to be out of 40 something. We haven't got the final figure on that yet, but something like about 46 or something will be the maximum possible for the new VAP. We're bringing quite a lot of new data items in. Sadly, we have to take the reading and the numeracy tests off because we don't get that data anymore. We now have online personalised assessments instead of the national tests, and they don't give us that data in a format that we can use there.
Thank you, Mike. Can I ask Councillor Fiona Gordon, please? Fiona, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Mike, the VAP is a really good way, I think, of sort of measuring who is vulnerable. As long as you use that information, obviously, to target resources to help the children who most need it. And I know from my work in Carmarthenshire that we often used to draw on cynnydd support, to sort of target those children. I think it's sort of implemented differently in different authorities. So is it the same in Swansea? Is a significant amount of what comes out of the VAP sort of passed to cynnydd to support? And if so, what are the plans when cynnydd comes to an end shortly, because the European Social Fund project, I think, what are the plans when that ends?
I don't know about the plans for cynnydd, but yes, the VAP data has been used in the cynnydd project to identify pupils. Not by itself, because obviously the VAP is only telling one part of the story. It's also been used with people like Careers Wales. They have a risk assessment that they do of the pupils that they're working with. And there's a pretty good correlation between their risk assessment and the VAP scores. It's not perfect because VAP can only measure what we've got data on. A careers advisor might pick up some other measure of vulnerability, which is something that we haven't got data on currently. But when we last looked at it, there was a pretty good match between who we said were vulnerable and who they reckon were vulnerable on there. I can't answer for the future of the cynnydd project, though, unfortunately.
Maybe that's something we can ask Helen in a future meeting, perhaps. What are the plans for that?
Yeah, can I come in, Chair?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, just to say that very question was raised by scrutiny recently in education, so we did provide a written response to scrutiny, and we'll make sure that is shared with the chair of this panel as well, so you can see the full response. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. Thank you, Fiona. Councillor Mike Lewis.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Obviously, I represent Mini Bark Ward, and we have various schools within our ward, Welsh and English schools, Welsh medium and English medium. I'd be very interested to know what the VAP scores are between the Welsh medium schools and the English medium schools, which obviously isn't in the breakdown that we've been given. Yes, my ward is a very deprived area, but why I'm asking the question is because although the current Welsh school is moving up to Penlan, it's been there for quite some time, and a lot of the deprived areas have sent their children to the Welsh medium school rather than the English medium school because we haven't got an English medium school, basically. So I'm just wondering, could those figures be supplied?
Yes, they could. Yeah, the data is all there, broken down by school. So yes, we can produce a table of the average VAP scores by school quite easily.
Thank you.
We've got quite detailed data, but we can go back to previous VAPs to look at trends on that if we need to as well. So that's all readily available there.
Could that be done and brought to the next meeting, Chair?
Yes, I can easily do that. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. That's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you, Mike, times 2. You can carry on, Mike Jones, please.
Okay. We then looked at the different areas of Swansea, looking at the wards, and we've worked out the average VAP score by ward. So we can see at the bottom that the average for Swansea is 4.0. What I've done is any ward which is higher than the Swansea average, I've coloured in pink there. So we can see which ones have got the relatively high VAP scores, and of course at the other end, the ones which have got the relatively low VAP scores. I mentioned earlier on the correlation between the VAP and deprivation measures, and if we were to measure this against the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, we'd get a pretty good correlation there. So higher deprivation means higher VAP scores, and vice versa there. If we were to do this from previous years' VAPs, we'd probably get a very, very similar table, I would have thought there as well. The Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, as I said, is based on these lower super output areas, which are contained within wards. So each ward has a number of different LSOA areas in there. So I know the question was asked earlier on about those LSOA areas. So this does answer it in a way. We can see the relative deprivation in those areas. There will be some wards, of course, which have got LSOAs which rank differently to one another on the WIMD. So there could be quite big contrasts within one ward, depending on which LSOA you're looking at. So when we get down to the more detailed data on the LSOAs, that perhaps gives us a better picture. The other thing we have to be careful of in any of this type of analysis is the age profile of these areas. If we look at the LSOA areas, some of them have got a lot more children in them than others, and others have got a lot more older people than others. So we do have to be careful of that. We know that on average there's 1,500 residents to an LSOA area, but that age profile, of course, can affect any analysis that we're doing, which is just based on children and young people.
Thank you, Mike. I think what that enables us to see, please correct me if I'm wrong in my thinking, is to look at an area like let's say Townhill at the top there, and to say, right, there's the ward area, but statistically Townhill is 6 LSOAs, 6 of those smaller areas, and we know one of those areas is not statistically deprived in Townhill. The Cockett, the Lawns, people will know in Cockett, it doesn't rate in the lowest 10% most deprived category. At the same time, in the same area, we've got parts of Mayhill, which rank in the 5% most deprived. So it's kind of Google Earthing, if you like, isn't it? Isn't it? Yeah. It's zooming in to the street level issues more than looking at the broader ward information, perhaps. Councillor Jan Curtis has got a hand up. Jan?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing as you, Mike, because in our ward in Penrhyn, which is just under the pink mark there, we've got quite a large area of deprivation, but also quite a large area of people really well off. So it's difficult, and you find sometimes the better off people are not sending the children to the local school, they're sending them to the Welsh school, which is in Kingsbridge. So, you know, it's difficult then to judge it, isn't it? You know, which of the figures are what I'm saying. It's hard to judge.
We could do this average VAP score by LSOA. That would be very easy to do. It might give us a better level of detail so we could judge it more.
Yeah.
I just think in every ward there's affluence and deprivation, and if you look at the whole of the thing, you've got both of you in every area, unfortunately.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Back to you, Mike.
Okay. This is a relatively simple one. We've known for a long time that there's a correlation between pupils eligible for free school meals and additional learning needs, the ALN. So what we've done here, again, just looking at the school census data from this year, we've looked at the 4 main ALN groups, and then which percentage of those groups, what percentage of those groups are claiming free school meals. So non-ALN pupils, 16.1, and then we can see that all of the ALN groups are relatively high, you know, well over 30%, nearly 40% with the pupils who've got statements, SEM statements there. And we can break this down in a lot of different ways. If you bring gender into this, there will be higher percentages for boys than for girls in there. We've broken this down in a lot of different ways over the years, but there's quite a distinct pattern there. And if we assume that there's a relationship between free school meals and deprivation, then we're seeing that those from the more deprived backgrounds are much more likely to have additional learning needs. But the figures speak for themselves, I suppose, there, really, don't they?
Thanks, Mike. I've got a sensitive area in mind here. If we've got an area where we have particular social and economic problems associated with alcohol or drink and drug abuse, maybe antisocial behaviour and crime, higher issues there. If we have concentrated issues, I remember in a previous meeting of the PDC, neural diversity was mentioned. So could these issues link to damage done through things like fetal alcohol syndrome before babies are born? Could this be like a longer term effect where we have concentrations of the most challenging social and economic behaviour patterns?
It would be an interesting one to study, wouldn't it? I haven't got any further data beyond the education data on that, but if we could make that link with other data, if it's available to suitable geography, it would be a fascinating one to do, wouldn't it?
That would be interesting. I can't remember the officer who did the report, Helen now, but it was very interesting to look at neural diversity. So, gestational issues in the womb, teratogen effects or damaging effects on the baby, drink, drugs, disease, chaotic lifestyles. So that the development of the child after birth then is hampered before they are born. And then so that would be an interesting one to look at, maybe health issues connected to things like low birth weight perhaps as well.
I think statistics on things like low birth weight are available at small area geographies, aren't they, to some extent? So if we can get that at LSOA level, we could easily correlate it with ALN, free school meals, and any other data that we want to look at. That would be quite straightforward to do.
Thank you, Mike. Hannah Lawson is indicating. Hannah?
Hi, thanks, Mike. This is really, really interesting information. Thank you so much for putting it together for us. I was just thinking about a school that's in my ward. I'm in Castle Ward, and we have a Skull Creek Glass special needs school in Castle Ward. I imagine that the catchment area, due to the nature of the school, the catchment area would be much wider and would extend outside of the ward. And I was wondering, really, just out of curiosity, you might not know this, but perhaps we could find out whether the trends that are that you've observed in the data for the kind of more regular, more local schools is reflected as well in schools like Creek Glass, or whether they have a different kind of trend in their data.
it's a different trend. Because Creeglass, there's relatively few pupils, usually around 50 on roll there at a time, but basically the whole county is their catchment area, so they are coming in from a much wider area. So they will be coming from a wide variety of different LSOAs into that school. So because of the relatively small number, 50 on roll, and we've got 150 LSOAs in Swansea, the amount of data there is too small to break it down just for that one school, really.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There's no one else indicating. Please carry on, Mike.
Moving on to exclusions, we've got a table and a couple of charts on this one. So we've looked at the last 10 years here, and there are fixed term and permanent exclusions. So fixed term, of course, are the majority. These are where they're away from school for a fixed period. Permanent, of course, are where they've been permanently excluded from that school, and then alternative provision of some kind has had to be found for them. And the first thing to note is that in the last 2 years, of course, the pandemic has affected this data, with the schools having been closed for fairly long periods, but also different year groups isolating at different times as well. If they're not in school, they're not there to be excluded, so we would expect a lower number of exclusions in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. We can see from the data that there was a steady increase up until 2018-19, and that's very much in line with the national data. If you look at this in terms of rate per 1,000 pupils, Swansea is fairly favourable compared to the national data published by the Welsh Government on this. So this increase in exclusions is being seen nationally across Wales. If I move on to the graphs, that's how it looks in terms of fixed term exclusions each year. So we can see we had a peak there in 1819, that indeed was Wales. That's the last data that's been published by the Welsh Government there. And then, of course, the fall in the last 2 years, largely because of the pandemic. Of course, the big question is, where would that have gone had we not had the pandemic? Would the trend for the last 3 years there have continued, or would it have plateaued? I think that's probably a fairly difficult one to answer.
Can I ask, sorry, Mike, Des Thomas has his hand up, and then Mike Lewis.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's a shame we don't have the figures, do we, the last couple of years? But if the trend did increase as it had previously, that would have been alarming, to say the least. The interesting statistics would be to know regarding the schools, which schools are excluding the greater number. I mean, we're all aware that it's the start of the slippery slope for many pupils. Is exclusion. Once they're excluded, it's to a great percentage of them, it's downhill from then on, and society obviously has to pick up the cost of that. Do we have it school by school, Mike?
Yes, we do. In a normal year, prior to the pandemic, we do an exclusions analyzer, which breaks this down by school, breaks it down by gender and other groups of pupils. It also breaks it down by reasons for exclusion as well. There's obviously a number of different reasons that they can be excluded for. So we can see who's been excluded for bullying, substance misuse, theft, and all the other different sort of misdemeanors, if you like, that can be there. So all that data is readily available and can be easily broken down from the system.
Okay, well, Chair, perhaps we can pick up the things that are coming up today that are announceable today for the next meeting.
Yes, definitely will. Can I ask, and I just noticed that Helen has put her hand up. Helen, did you want to add to what Des just said, or do you want to come in a bit later?
Yeah, just adding to what Des just said in terms of the availability of kind of live up-to-date data. A lot of what Mike is showing is obviously headline data that's collected on an annual basis. And I know if we look at our permanent exclusions, for example, in the last academic year, they reached 28. Now, had we had, if we wouldn't have had disruption to education, then you could see that figure is in excess of normal expectation in terms of permanent exclusions. So there is a lot of data and soft intelligence below this headline information, and it would be good potentially to invite officers such as our inclusion officer, those looking at matters on a school by school basis, to come along really to explain a little bit more of the story behind this headline data.
That's lovely. Thanks, Helen. We've got Mike Lewis next.
Yeah, just a quick one. We've going back to exclusions. Have the parameters for excluding pupils changed during 2016-2017? And would that have been a factor in the increase in exclusions after that date?
I'm not aware of anything there. I think maybe, as Helen was saying, perhaps if we bring the inclusion officer in at another time to perhaps talk about that. But I don't remember there being any change. The data has been collected in exactly the same way every year, and it's being measured in exactly the same way. This is one of the few data sets which hasn't really changed its methodology over time.
Yeah, it's strange how all of a sudden there's a big leap in 2016, 2017. It was going on pretty smoothly, and then all of a sudden, so there must be some reason for it, underlying reason for that happening.
And it's in the All Wales data as well. It's seen nationally.
As I said, unless the parameters have been changed or they're being interpreted in a harsher way, that could possibly be a factor. I don't know. I'm just puzzled by it. That's all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mike. We've got Sam Pritchard next. Sam?
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. I was going to pick up on similar themes to Mike, really, in that rise is quite exponential, isn't it? But I think I'm right in saying that given that pupils were not in school for that longer period in 2020 and 2021, those numbers of fixed term exclusions are still incredibly high, even for those years, aren't they? So clearly, I think this is an ongoing problem. You did, in responding to Mike, state that this is the All Wales figures show something similar, which I think is very interesting. But I do think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done here, because we obviously know how difficult it is for those children who are then excluded to actually have an opportunity to, reform themselves and to have a decent education after that. So I think this is a really important area, actually, Chair, that I think we should look at in a bit more detail, particularly if children return to school, as normal eventually. The figures should, presumably will rise massively again. Although, I do, as has already been stated, repeat that this isn't a Swansea problem, it's an All Wales problem. But particularly as Swansea councillors, I think we do care about this issue, particularly in Swansea.
Thank you, Sam. Can I go to Fiona Gordon next, please?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering whether the some young people might have been excluded due to breaking COVID rules and breaking bubbles. So when they were in school, that might have added on to the number of children who were excluded, even under sort of the stop and start of the last year or so. But I wanted to ask a question as well. Will the recent changes to the PRU have an impact on the number of exclusions, do we think? Is there part of what is planned, for the new PRU setup, is part of that to reduce exclusions as well? I don't know if Mike will know that, or maybe Helen.
Well, we've got two hands up at the moment, and as luck would have it, one is the Cabinet Member Robert Smith, and one is the Director Helen Morgan-Rees. So can I ask one or other to go next, please?
Well, I was hoping someone would say both what Fiona said and what Sam said, because I think that this is an area which we certainly are looking at, and I'd be hoping to involve the committee in moving this agenda forward. Yes, there is a great new facility that's seen a lot of investment in Maestro, but I think that is part of a much wider piece of work that we need to do to address these issues. How do we support schools to ensure that more of our pupils continue in mainstream? How do we make sure that the schools have the support they need to reintegrate children as far as possible? All of these issues, they're not, it's easy to say. It's a much bigger challenge to implement in reality, but it's something I think we need to do and take a lead here, because as you said, this is an all Wales problem, but it's a Swansea problem as well, and I think we need to look at this in detail and develop that as a priority.
Thank you, Robert. Helen?
Yeah, just to echo some comments and to come back really in terms of Councillor Gibbard, Councillor Gordon, sorry, just to say that the PIU obviously is almost at the sharp end of things, but we do have a positive behaviour strategy or policy that we are trying to embed in our schools. Obviously that was hit by COVID, and the embedding of that policy is something we're still aspiring to do. But that positive behaviour strategy is absolutely key to all of this. Personally, I believe as a director there is no good outcome for any child who is permanently excluded, and even those who are excluded on a fixed term basis. It's almost an adverse childhood experience in itself for them. So we have to counter that in. And obviously I'm not aware that there's been a discernible change in guidance by Welsh Government during this spike in exclusions. But obviously, as pointed out, there are interpretations of the guidance, and we are keen as a local authority to make sure we have timely dialogue with our schools to make sure that they're following the guidance correctly and that they are seeking advice from the local authority, particularly in the case of permanent exclusions, because of the consequences not only on children but their families as well.
Thank you, Helen. And can we move on to Mike Lewis, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry to go back over old ground on this, but this committee has been promoting vocational education to run alongside academic education for the last 4 years. I believe this would reduce these exclusion figures dramatically, because as we've been banging on for the last 4 years, there are a lot of people from deprived areas that are not academically, how can I explain? Not as academically endowed as other pupils. We do get the odd one. I mean, I know personally, I know a man who went to Harvard School, and he ended up as a chairman of the Shanghai Bank. So it doesn't matter where you're from, but a lot of these pupils from deprived areas, they are more suited to a vocational education rather than an academic one. And I keep banging on about it. I'm sorry if it's music to everybody's ears. I suppose old music to everybody's ears. But we have to do something to promote more vocational education within our schools. That's my feeling, and I won't change my views on that. So I'm sorry to bang on about it, Chair, but I do feel it has a bearing. Thank you very much.
Mike, can I say, please don't apologise for that. I know we've had many conversations over time, and there's a strong feeling amongst many councillors on this committee and other committees that vocational education is the way forward for so many young people. I won't say too much here, but I know I had a conversation this week with the head of a Swansea school who is shouting from the rooftops in the same context for the same reasons, and it would be interesting as we go forward to hear to that strong voice for amending our current offer as we go forward as well, particularly for those children and young people who are perhaps less likely to fly what can I say, in a traditional academic context, perhaps. Thank you, Mike.
Alternative curriculum.
Yes, thank you, Des, yes. So there's no other hands indicating. Can we go back to Mike Jones, please?
The final slide I've got then is just the equivalent for the permanent exclusions. And again, of course, the last 2 years. High figure there. Helen, you wanted to talk about this one, didn't you?
Yes, thank you, Mike. Really grateful for your input and preparation of all those slides. Really insightful, and hopefully the committee feels the same as I do, so thank you. So just to touch upon the final slides in the presentation in terms of Operation Encompass. Now, some of you as school governors may be familiar with the term. Operation Encompass is something that we started in Swansea in conjunction with South Wales Police in November 2019. An Operation Encompass enables contact between South Wales Police and currently the Education Department almost on a daily basis. And the contact we have with South Wales Police is about children who have heard or witnessed domestic violence in the home. And what we do with the information is that we share that with a key named person in every school, so that if a child goes to school the following morning having heard or witnessed domestic violence in the home, their well-being is paramount. So this is an illustration to you, and this is really a tip of the iceberg in terms of figures, and I'll touch upon what they actually mean in a minute. So what we're seeing is children in our schools who have obviously had this traumatic experience, and what we know about domestic abuse is by the time somebody has contacted police, very often it's not the first time they'd have experienced domestic abuse. So children, not just one child in the family, siblings as well, obviously have this experience, and it does not help their education because they are very often traumatized and need particular support during the school day. So this is an immediate response, and it's one of the most impactful things we do in education at the moment, is making sure we preserve this contact with South Wales Police. Now, this information really belies some of the statistics, but you can see during lockdown, when we entered into lockdown in March 2020, there seemed to be a spike 2 months later. So we were seeing nearly 300 cases a month. Okay. Now, when I say cases, these are contacts. So if there were 3 siblings in a family, you could actually treble that figure. Okay. So that is in 1 month. And these are just children between the ages of 3 and 16. Okay. So they're obviously children who have been affected by what they've heard or seen. Many other authorities are undertaking Operation Encompass activities. Carmarthenshire and Neath Talbot, as our neighbours, do it. It first started, I think, in the southwest of England, and essentially it is ensuring that these children are supported because they are particularly vulnerable at a particular point in their education. So that sharing of information between external agencies to a school is absolutely crucial, and we're quite proud really that we've been able to get this up and running to make sure that we keep our children our children's well-being at the heart of what we do in education. So happy to take questions. Was there another slide, Mike? I know you've got control, or was that just the only slide?
That's the only one.
That's fine. Okay, thank you.
Can we leave the slide there for a minute? I've got a question next now from Councillor Sam Pritchard.
Yeah, thank you, Shah. I just wanted to draw attention to this because I think it really is vital, and I think looking at the rise and the effect that lockdown has had, I think is quite staggering, really, isn't it? And, you know, I know as a council, we've done a lot around, you know, opposing violence against women, which is primarily it is, but I know we've done a lot of anti-domestic abuse things, but I just wanted to say that it's really encouraging that schools are liaising with police in this proactive way. And I take it from what you said, Helen, that the relationship between schools and police is dramatically improved and is continuing to improve. And I just wanted to commend really the work that's being done, because I think when a lot of people think about schools and the need for helping children and things like that, they often think about the school setting, but looking at what's happening in the child's home and how that impacts a child's learning outcomes and experience, I think is essential. And I just wanted to commend the council for you know, what it is doing to help to protect these children. And you know, I don't think as an education department you get thank yous very often. So I just wanted to raise that it is vital work, and I'm really glad that we are doing it as a council.
Lovely, thank you very much, Sam. Can we take the slide down now? Mike, if you could remove the slide to stop the show, come back so we can see more people on the screen perhaps then. And Helen Morgan-Rees is indicating.
Yeah, just to close the presentation really in terms of what this is pointing towards. So obviously this points towards the headline data of vulnerable children across Swansea, and no matter how you cut it, there will always be vulnerabilities in every school in Swansea, in every ward in Swansea. And it really is about a personalised education, and it really is about going the extra mile for certain children and recognising their vulnerabilities at the earliest opportunity, and also ensuring that they have added provision, stuff that will meet their needs. So what I mean by that, and going back to originally the remit of this committee, was to consider really how we would support and champion and mentor from a community angle, how that would play out in terms of how we go the extra mile to add value to children's education who are most vulnerable. So I think what this points to is that there are vulnerabilities across a range of different areas, but it's recognising that some schools need to go the extra mile. But when you look at a school and pupil level, there will always be children who have faced adverse childhood experiences, and we haven't really touched much upon that. And it's recognising what more can we add to a school to help top up the education, the enriched curriculum that some of these children in our schools need.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Helen. Can I support what you say and echo what Sam said? You know, this is fantastic. I mean, the Operation Encompass work is particularly insightful and brilliant, because those flashpoints of horrific experience are something which most of us have never experienced in our lives. And we know then that affects the psychology of the children, leads to attachment issues, separation and loss, imprisonment, antisocial behaviour. It's simply a nightmare. And you've then got to try to educate the children in a formal environment. So the challenges are huge. It seems to me now that that Mike, I've got to thank you. I always thank Mike whenever I talk to him, but he always confuses me because it's so challenging. He's brilliant information. So as we go forward, now we've looked at the statistics up to this point. Helen mentioned adverse childhood experiences, and I know they can be quite controversial in some fields. I know the Children's Commissioner last year raised some concerns in some ways. Very important area, though, that we look at adverse childhood experiences. So as we move forward, I suggest in our organic way that we look, as Helen touched on earlier, at the stories of the children who are most affected by the data. So if we can think in those terms and consider ideas of adverse childhood experiences, perhaps the inclusion issues that we touched on, permanent and temporary exclusion, the criteria for that, different childhoods and different normalities. Mike said about the person who rose to the top of global banking, but he would have had people sitting next to him in class who didn't have that success in future. Other people would have gone on a downward spiral. What happened there and why? So does that seem like a sensible summary for us to focus on from next for next time? Because then we'll be heading then to get a perspective from the schools from Pendrahafod and Dillon Thomas schools, reflecting the experience of their clusters as well. Can I ask the committee whether they think that's a sensible next step, and of course for Helen and the cabinet member? Lyndon, and then Des.
Totally support that. That sounds interesting to drive that forward. You know, really useful. And I also support the point that Councillor Mike Lewis made earlier about vocational education.
Thank you, Lyndon. Des? You're on silent, Des. You're on mute.
Yes, right. Yeah, I'd agree with that, Chair. What the data is obviously showing us is that teachers are not just teachers, are they? They're social workers. There are lots of things all rolled into one. And as a parent of a teacher, I get annoyed when I hear the public saying, "Oh, teachers got an easy job, you know, 9 till 3 or whatever, and all those long holidays." And I'm sure Fiona will back me up with this. What really goes on in the teacher's life is far, far more than those hours and holidays. Teachers, they're the first point of contact, aren't they, with the child? When the child leaves the home in the morning, after the parents, the teachers are the first point of contact, and that's where all this information is picked up. Through the Encompass scheme, you know, that's when the information is passed on to the staff. And throughout the day, the teachers are picking up things continuously, not just teaching. It's very important. But it's a shame that you know, COVID has skewed the data that's before us. It's put us off track to a certain extent. It would be interesting to know, you know, if the trends are continuing, and indeed the new unit in Cockett, that, you know, if that was up and running now, what effect that would be having. Because as Mike Lewis has said, we've talked about this not just 4 or 5 years. It's the last decade. I think we've been talking about it. We've been having reports before us in this committee that shows us that an alternative curriculum is needed by many pupils to keep them on the straight and narrow, to keep their interest in school, and we're aware that some schools are more ready to expel pupils or you know, than others, and this is to be avoided at all costs. So yes, let's bring it all together next meeting in readiness then for the head teachers in Pendrahafod and Dillon Thomas. And we know that some of the good work that's been done in Pendrahafod, we've visited there in the past. So and we were hoping that would cascade to other schools. You know, some schools are excelling at what we want them to do. I'm not sure about other schools, but we need to cascade that the good work that's been done. Thanks, Chair.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Des. Just very quickly before I move on to Hannah and then to Lyndon. Recently, I do a lot of talking anyway, but I've been doing a lot of talking about particularly about education skills recently, and I've asked people a couple of questions about what transformed their lives when they were younger. One person who's had a life in plumbing said that he learned to change a tap, old-fashioned brass tap. He learned to change a washer when he was in primary school. That was the seed planted, away he went, career in plumbing. And I've asked people, sporting people, local excellence I'm talking about, not playing for Wales and national excellence and Olympics, but local sporting clubs. Can you imagine your life without sport? And I've asked this question to dozens of sportsmen and women, and they all came across with the impression that I summarised it saying they were brainwashed into sporting activity before they were 10. And that was the gel that held their life together. Right, one of my friends, he's a Swansea business owner. He is 61. He's playing hockey for Wales and cricket for Wales next year again. I said, don't, it's going to kill you, but he's going to do it anyway. It's a lifelong passion. So vocational, educational, sporting, intermingled is interesting for me. And can I move on to Hannah now, please?
Hi, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I would just be interested in putting in a request, Helen, if it's possible, when we do discuss adverse childhood experiences, whether there would be any opportunity to look at provision for children who have English as a second language or don't speak a huge amount of English, and how that is affected. I mean, my ward is particularly diverse, and I'm thinking about a pupil that I met quite recently who didn't speak any English, had obviously suffered a lot of trauma before he'd arrived in this country, and staff were unable to really communicate with him about that trauma, and obviously that's very, very difficult for everybody involved. And yeah, I'd just really like to sort of explore any provision that's made in that area, really. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Hannah. And on to Lyndon.
Yeah, I'm just going to follow on from the point that Des made, actually. He mentioned Pentre Habit School, and I'd say Dylan Thomas as well, because those of us who visited Dylan Thomas School were so impressed, and we met a number of the pupils, and they were great ambassadors as they took us around the school. And I think they were a credit to the school, and how they'd help the teachers and the head at that school, how they'd help drive up attendance. So I think there were some real good examples at that school as well.
Absolutely agree with that, Lyndon. And I was shuffling in my papers there for something that I'm going to tell you this. I wasn't going to mention this, but in Dylan Thomas, the newsletter from July 2021 year, the first line says about one of their pupils, former head girl, who I think we might have met when we went there, I'm not sure, who's been accepted to study at Oxford University, right? So I think she might have been around, you know, but she's been accepted to go to Oxford. Of course, she left Dylan Thomas a few years ago now, but, you know, so there's academic success, as Mike Lewis said, there's academic success, there's all kinds of success in schools, but we need to sort of take our blinkers off and look more broadly for vocational opportunities and others to keep people on the path of success, whatever that means for them. So do we have any other concluding comments? Are we okay? Can I thank you all? Can I thank Mike Jones in particular, Helen and colleagues, as ever, of course. The contributions we've had here, I found that really exciting. I mean, genuinely exciting, and with such enthusiasm and momentum from all of you. And we are looking to realign and reshape educational and vocational opportunities, education and skills for a huge amount of children in Swansea. And that's something we should all be excited about. I know we are. So on that point, can I close the meeting? And once again, thank you all. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.